May the words on my lips and the meditations upon my heart be always pleasing in your sight, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Good morning. Welcome. We have made it to another new year. This Sunday is the first Sunday in Advent, the Sunday also called Hope Sunday, and the first day of the new year in the church calendar. So, Happy New Year. And this year, just as every year, we begin this new lectionary cycle, not where some might expect, not with stories of beginnings, not with the story of Jesus' birth, or even with the story of the beginning in Genesis, but rather we begin at the end, with Jesus' description of the apocalypse. And I suspect that for at least a couple of us here, it might seem a little jarring that we would begin this season of anticipation of Jesus' birth, this day of hope, with this text about the signs in the sun, the stars, the moon and the earth, distress among the nations, the heavens shaking, confusion everywhere, the seas roaring and waves crashing, people fainting from fear and foreboding. I know that I, for one, come to this Advent season, and especially this year, full of longing. Longing for signs of hope, longing for tidings of comfort and joy. If I wanted to hear about signs of despair and the world falling apart, I would have just stayed home and turned on the news or flipped through social media or YouTube or what have you. In this information age, it seems I can't get away from bad news. Every day there's something about carbon emissions, global temperatures rising, melting permafrost, anxiety in the markets, tension among nations, tensions within this nation. And that's to say nothing about this pandemic that has dominated our lives now for almost 2 years. We're surrounded, it seems, by portents of things falling apart. Everywhere we turn, it seems someone is there to tell us about another thing that we need to worry about. So I imagine that for some, at least, it would be a bit disheartening to then come to church longing for that good news and hear more about the world tearing apart. Like, really? I got out of bed for this? But as I reflect on these images amidst the turmoil of our current times, I cannot also but help to reflect on the fact that it's always been this way. Every generation of Christians since the very first have been able to see in their various situations signs of the end. And very often this has led to people in every generation speculating about whether or not this was it. These are the end times. And I'm certain that somewhere, even this morning, somewhere in the world, somewhere in this country, some preacher is combing through the news like a fortune teller reading tea leaves in order to prove that, yep, this is it. It's now. We're here now. We're living now in the end. So I'm just going to get one thing out of the way. I'm not that preacher. Because when we approach these texts only through this lens of fortune telling, I fear that we end up missing Jesus' bigger point. I do not believe that Jesus is trying to predict the future, but rather to say something about the present. Namely, that in every moment, everything we know is already passing away. It's the broad applicability of these texts and the ability of people in every time and place to hear their situation reflected in these texts that seems part of Jesus' intent. Ends come in every age and in every moment. That is the reality of our temporal existence. But the good news is that that's not the whole story. Because if it is true that every moment brings with it an end, then every moment brings with it the seeds of a new beginning. Every moment is a moment ripe with promise. As Jesus reminds us in this parable of the fig tree, that for just as we see the first leaves of the fig tree and know that it means summer is coming, so too we see the signs of things falling apart and know that God's kingdom is drawing near. And so he says, stand tall, raise your head, look up, stay awake, be alert. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. And he says this not with the kind of judgmental overtones that we might expect from that doomsday preacher on the street corner demanding that time is short, so you better amend your life fast or suffer. Rather, he says it as a compassionate plea, a plea from one who knows just how dark life can be, just how painful it can be, and who knows how tempting it is to give in to the weight of despair and go to sleep, to go numb in the face of the scariness of life and the painfulness of loss. But that, he says, is a trap. For by going numb and turning our backs on the brokenness around us and in us, we ultimately also close ourselves off to the possibility for renewal. We close ourselves off to hope. Hope is not like a magic pill, like a vaccine, if I may, which prevents us from experiencing the pain of loss, the sense of despair, but rather hope is born from those experiences. It is born out of that longing for a better world that takes root in us when amidst the brokenness and pain, we hear that voice welling up, like that voice crying out in the wilderness says, no, this is not the way things are supposed to be. There is a better world. The theologian Jürgen Moltmann has said that Christian hope is not the opiate of the beyond, but the divine power that makes us alive here and now. To hope, then, is not simply to wish for a better world someday, but to imagine what God would have now and to act accordingly. It is to orient ourselves now to that realm of God which is always near and yet ever on the horizon. So we come then to this season of Advent not simply to gaze longingly on that horizon, but to allow that longing to burn in us, that God's Spirit might be born in us, that God's law of love may be written into our hearts, that standing tall amidst the world's brokenness, our acts of love may be a beacon of hope and a reflection of the world that is to come. Amen.